Welcome to the Sleeping Barber podcast.
In today's episode, V and I are debating whether marketing is in trouble. We look at CMO tenure. We look at the decline in marketing effectiveness and talking about misguided perspectives and trying to evaluate whether marketing really is in trouble. So welcome and enjoy the show.
Welcome to the Sleeping Barber podcast, a place for business leaders to get the best and most credible information on marketing, strategy, and innovation. Your hosts, Marc Binkley and Vassilis Douros, share their experiences as they gather insights from the world's leading experts. Now, on with the show.
Welcome to the show. We're really excited. Marc and I have been throwing around this idea about is marketing in trouble for quite some time. I want to say, Marc, it goes back to about January. We were just kind of doing some of our brainstorming of topics that we'd like to talk about. And I think what really became the catalyst is a lot of the guests have come on. They've given us a lot of golden information, which is incredible. But even our own life experience are showing that maybe there is something about marketing and the discipline right now that is somewhat struggling, if I were to kind of articulate it very simply. And as we continue, to interview various guests, and sometimes we'd have off-camera discussions, I think our hypothesis, if you will, was really starting to come through in some sense of, no, there is some more substance here. So we obviously started the digging process and trying to understand, hey, what potentially is wrong. But I think just to kind of kick things off, when we think about marketing as a discipline, it is such a young discipline at the same time. Why do you think is it that marketing usually gets a shorter end of the stick, or could constitute why we're essentially in the state of being somewhat maybe undermine's not the right word, but sometimes I do feel that, if I'm being completely honest.
Well, I think there's like a lack of identity for marketing, because often people think of it in terms of sales. Like sales and marketing naturally go together like peas and carrots. And so I think there's always an expectation that marketing is just a digital version of sales somehow, but it's not really. I mean, marketing is a distinct discipline from sales. And I think because of the, let's call it infancy, or I'll call it infancy, but the lack of maturity within the marketing world, a modern marketing world. Like if we say John Wanamaker is the father of modern advertising, he's the guy that came up with, half my advertising is wasted, trouble is I just don't know which half. I think he said that in like 1910 or something like that, right? Long time ago, but it's basically 100 years, the modern version of marketing. And so you've got really a pretty like new field, new discipline that you mentioned. And I think because of that, within the system of a business, it's not as clear what the role of marketing is. And I think it's becoming clear, but I think it's partly because of that, the marketing gets maybe pushed around into different areas of business. And so there's this sort of lack of definition about what we're supposed to do.
You bring up a very, very valid point, and I'll just highlight one point in my career where, there's nothing that I would have ever expected, to be honest. But, the company was working for probably during north of, $5 billion. So it's not a small company. But what I found that was really unique is the role marketing played was strictly that of making sure, it was kind of driving a revenue or attributing some sort of revenue. So it was just very revenue focused, performance focused and whatnot. But there was a series of changes, but the actual role in marketing actually didn't have a seat at the executive table.
Right.
Because the highest ranking marketer was at the director level.
Yeah.
And I thought that was unique because when you have a company that does, north of like $4 or $5 billion, naturally you would assume that marketing would have had a larger say in those settings. So, mind you, focus group of one, and I don't know how many other organizations have suffered something similar. But I think that kind of, for me, is sometimes the root end of the problem. Everyone can be a marketer.
Yeah.
But at the same time, they diminish the actual value marketing can bring to the organization by not giving it its voice or its equal voice.
Yeah.
And, in our research, we came across a super interesting stat that talked about, the average CMO tenure is only about 3 years or less.
Yeah.
That for me was like a huge tell. Like, wait a second, what happened here?
Yeah.
Why are you have CEOs, CFOs, they're in their roles for north of 4, 5, 6 years easily, but a CMO, they're constantly moving. And is it because we get bored naturally and we want to move to different disciplines and constantly test ourselves? Or is it because we're not effective in the roles? I don't know.
Well, yeah, like I would say, so for the sake of this conversation, why don't we just do a quick overview? Because I think that's one of the points of that we've kind of come up with, or pieces of evidence that would suggest marketing is in trouble. I think CMO tenure is one of those things. Declining in effectiveness is another one. And then misguided perspectives would be a third thing. And so I think it's worth just like summarizing that to let people know we're going to be going with this conversation. But I think in terms of the CMO tenure comment, I mean, you and I both have been doing research trying to figure this out. And so there's like, everybody's seen these kind of articles about the decline in the CMO tenure, and it's about half, I think, of the rest of the C-suite, or at least the CEO. And so some of the reasons that are given for that, typically because of the complexity of the role. You've got somebody who's got to be, let's say she's got to be really intuitive with being creative. She also has to be really intelligent when it comes to business financials and metrics. And also has to be a great partner for sales and a great partner for HR, for employer talent brand. And has to find ways to be analytical, in that they are the voice of the customer and consumer-centric and all those kinds of things. Communicate that with, product development teams. A lot of times I think, though, what ends up coming down, the marketing role comes down to is the being promotional, just one of the P's. Well, I know we'll talk about that more, but I think it's kind of this conflict with, and that's what I mean by the role definition and the immaturity within the role. I don't know that it's the person so much as the role is symptomatic of the stage that marketing is in.
That's a great point. It is, if you think about it, it is probably one of the most unique roles, especially once you reach that CMO level, where you're constantly fighting between the two halves, if you will, of the brain. Your constant creative side that you naturally, you need to have as a marketer, but then obviously making sure you're staying close to the business and the needs of the business. So being super analytical, understanding, the pain points or any friction point there in the organization and how you navigate that. It's almost like we're saying that you got to be kind of a unicorn in some aspects to be able to do that, because other disciplines don't require that. I guess the gamma's not as big when you're thinking about it in context, accounting is accounting. Like,
yeah, I think so. And like a head of operations would be, I mean, they're all the role, like, especially when you're talking about a C-suite or executive level role, like they're all complex roles to begin with, because business is complex, which is part of what makes it exciting. But on top of that, then, is this, what we were just describing there, I think is partly the lack of definition for the CMO, because they're like, literally, I mean, if you think about marketing in general, in terms of like, what are the disciplines it pulls on to provide information? So research is one, creative is one, science is one, sales is one, math is one, like human behavioral economics could be another one. Like there's so many disciplines that go into marketing that make for a good marketer. We talked about this in one of our podcasts about what are the kind of skills you need to develop early in your career. And so all these things play a role in the marketer's life. And I think because the diversity of what makes up a marketer, it's hard to find that one person that does all those things really well.
Yeah.
Or can balance them all and understand them all. Because you probably have a natural tendency, if you're a marketer coming up through, say, creative stream or from a performance marketing stream or a branding stream, that you have more thought process one way or another and less about the holistic point of view, which I think ultimately is a big part of the reason why training and courses are really important.
Totally. Well, another interesting trend is you're seeing now, and again, this could speak to, what you were talking about earlier about the role of a marketer, but you're seeing the merging of a CMO and CDO, right? The chief digital officer and chief marketing officer.
Oh yeah, I forgot about that one too. Right.
Right. Like there is that as well. So now you have to be really comfortable and understand technology, not only the discipline of marketing, the role technology plays in your ability to target, make sure you have like one central view of the customer, blah, 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 blah. And that is a whole other skill set as well.
Yeah.
Right. But it almost seems like you're seeing more of that now just because it's a lot more tangible.
Yeah.
You can really kind of, it's more succinct. You can say, well, this is the technology you need. You can come with roadmaps, blah, blah, blah. And it gives those individuals a level of, I want to be careful of the word I use here. It's not really gravitas, but naturally people are intimidated by technology.
Sure.
Right. So the individual that holds that position of, say, CDO/CMO has to have a really strong presence and understanding of all things tech and then how they parlay into the marketing world. But sometimes you're seeing less of the creativity in those roles and more on the technical ability of understanding the technology because those are, again, two different skill sets. They're not the same.
Yeah.
But it's almost like, well, you know what? You can add marketing there.
Yeah.
It's like, we don't know where to put little Johnny, but take Johnny.
Yeah. Well, even like I was just thinking about that, I was smiling because like I know you spent a lot of time bringing programmatic in-house and figuring out how to do that, which is not like a thing that everybody does.
No.
And it's not something that you just do like one day. I'm like, oh, today we're doing programmatic in-house. Like there's a whole host of things that have to go into that. And so you're right. Like I think that the technology part, especially with marketing now, there's this also the codependency on IT as well.
Huge.
Yeah, it's just a mass. And I think there's also this expectation that, with the digitization of marketing, that you now have this ability or perception that marketing can measure and attribute everything to, the initial point of contact and follow the dotted line all the way through to the sale, the conversion, whatever. And then, therefore marketers should be able to completely justify with a ROAS every penny on their budget.
Totally. It's funny. I'm not going to go off script here, but in this, just at work talking about media mix modeling and multi-touch attribution. And a lot of people are talking about those things that they're the same, but they're not the same. And then there's like understanding, again, some of the technical elements of what does a multi-touch attribution model actually provide for you? While at the same time, what does an MMM actually provide for you? But again, it's two different thought streams. One's very performance driven, right? While the other is like all encompassing. Here are my marketing efforts in totality and their effects on revenue. Right. But it's looking at it it's being combined when it shouldn't be combined. And I think, again, that goes back to the notion that maybe there isn't that clear definition of what is the role of a marketer, how to measure marketing. And it's not just about a ROAS.
Mm-hmm.
You know, we were talking to Grace recently on a podcast.
Mm-hmm.
It's like, well, start thinking about ESOV a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
And how does that play into you understanding your efforts
Mm-hmm.
in totality?
Yeah, and I mean, just a couple of counterpoints to the death of the CMO, or it seems like we always talk about the death of something. That's another one too. That's interesting. Dying. Like, why do we always talk about? Yeah, why do we always talk about the death of everything? Like, it's the death of TV, it's the death of radio, the death of print, the death of like probably the death of Facebook, the death of Instagram, the death. You know what I mean? They're all. We love killing our own tools. Like, it's a weird thing.
Our own discipline.
I don't think I've heard that about it. Like, you never hear someone go, the death of the cash flow statement. Like, it's all, you never hear that.
Death of the law of gravity.
Yeah. But just as a counterpoint to the CMO tenure thing. So I did find an article from Forbes as a counterpoint to that. So there is a study that's been for the last 18 years from what I gather. There's a company called Spencer Stuart that has been doing these CMO tenure reports. And so their counterpoint to that Spencer Stuart study, Spencer Stuart is like a recruitment firm. So the counterpoint to that is that they're saying, well, it's a small study with only 100 CMOs. And so there's the last study they did, there was 4 empty spots. So you have already 4 people that are not in, like, of the 100 that they interviewed, like 4 were just not in a job. So you're already starting with a sort of skewed number. And because the sample size is small, the statistical validity of that report is a little bit questionable. They talked about, if you look at the most influential CMOs from Forbes, over 40% of them have been in that position for quite some time. So they've been there for more than 4 years. So they're over the benchmark that the CMO study says, which is they only last 3 years. So almost half of the world's influential CMOs are already in that position, or like having been in excess of that 3-year benchmark. Wow, I feel like I butchered that. But anyway, you get my point.
Yeah, no. And it is a valid point. You know, like if you look some of the most successful CMOs, they likely have a tenure in one organization longer than that.
Yeah.
You know, well, what the stat was showing, like 3 years, which is, and there's some that obviously come to mind. You see the success, say everyone talks about Steve Jobs and whatnot, but it's one of those things where, you almost need time to kind of really ingrain yourself in with a company. I also found a study just around, it was Forbes that kind of talked about, how do CEOs grade their CMOs? So I'm going to kind of, while I understand like the statistical anomaly that may exist with that one, I'm going to kind of counter again there where, this article really kind of articulated that, 55% of CEOs grade their CMOs with a B. Like, I don't know any high achieving CMO that would like to hear that, right? 30% of them gave their CMOs a failing grade when it came to things like strategy and innovation.
Well, let's talk about strategy next, because that's a whole other thing that I love that you brought that up. But let's definitely talk about that one for sure.
No, of course. And the only thing I want to highlight there, the strategy and innovation, I think as marketers, we pride ourselves in strategy and innovation, or the fact that we can, easily navigate those spaces. But obviously something's being lost in translation. And well, why don't we go there?
Yeah. It's a perfect segue. Let's
go. Let's go.
Because that's the point number 2 is talking about decline in effectiveness. And, and so the evidence there is, as you mentioned, there's a perception that there's a complete void in strategy. Yeah. There's also work from Peter Field and Orlando Wood talking about a decline in effectiveness overall. And they're using the IPA database, Peter Field is. And then Orlando Wood separately in his own research, looking at performance in general for marketing. And so the two of them concluded that there's a general decline in effectiveness for marketing over the last, I don't know how many years, but actually Peter Fields was that there's creatively awarded campaigns have gone from delivering an average of 1.9 very large business effects in 2008 to about 1.4 in recent years. So there's suggestion that marketing is becoming less effective. And some of the explanations for that is like increasing pressure to deliver short-term ROI, which we've talked about a little bit before in different podcasts. There's that example like Burger King, you know, that moldy Whopper.
Yeah.
The decaying Whopper.
Yeah.
So apparently that's won a whole bunch of awards, which baffles me. But great, it won a bunch of awards. But I think Burger King in general, I'd have to find the numbers for sure. But they're not doing well financially in terms of like their position in the market and their market share versus competitors. Yeah. So, you know, you're awarding, I think that's the point that Peter and Orlando are making. You're giving awards to companies and agencies and so on and so forth without showing why they should be, like from a business point of view, why they should be winning awards. So it's like, yeah, great. The creative is amazing by whatever criteria, but it's not because it's helping the business. It's just because we like the ads.
We liked it.
Yeah.
We have our own even example of that where the numbers do get in some of those awards, and I don't mean to derail your thought here, but awards can be so, you know, superficial in so many ways. And I think we do value them, don't get me wrong, and we value creativity. But even sometimes when they're presenting these awards and they talk about the efficacy of the campaigns and the KPIs that they're doing, well, we all know sometimes those KPIs could be somewhat doctored a little bit.
Yeah. I mean, on that note, like creative, and that's not to say creative isn't important. Like I genuinely think creative, well, actually it's not even me thinking it. Paul Dyson, I had a chance to interview him, not on this podcast, but one I used to do. So he worked at Kantar for a period of time and they developed a report looking at I'm going to butcher this a little bit, but the factors that most affect business performance. And number one was company size.
Right.
Or I think it was ad profitability or advertising profitability. It was the outcome they were looking for. Company size is one. So, which makes sense. Like the bigger a company, the more you can leverage from any single ad. Like if you have one store and you're running an ad in one city, that's, you know, you're going to get a return, let's say. But if you have three stores, that same ad is more efficient because you have three stores.
Yeah.
So that's the idea there. Things like what marketers thought would be number 2, 3, and 4 were things like my budget, my targeting, my media choices, things like that. What action? And then they thought creative was like 7 or 8 or 9 on the list. Creative turns out to be number 2 by a long shot. Yeah. So I do think there's if there is such a thing as a silver bullet, I do think creative is really important. But just awarding creative for the sake of it being creative is not a good practice in my mind.
No, I would agree with you with that because, you know, again, if we're not doing ourselves any favor, it is awarding a lot of those campaigns that maybe didn't have a true impact to the business, saying that, hey, this is what you should be aspiring to do. Where the reality is, not to say that the creative itself wasn't beautifully executed and, you know, amazing. However, if it didn't have a true impact to the business, then I would argue, did it not fall flat?
Yeah. Fair.
Right. So let's get into the notion of zero strategy.
Yeah. Well, so I think there's when it comes to creative, there's in some cases zero strategy in the creative because it's just creative for creative's sake. It's not, the strategy is not, you're not making choices about that moldy Whopper because it's providing incremental lift in your sales, So that would be one thing. But there's also this incredible report that was done, I think just last year. I forget where the guys are from, somewhere in the UK or Australia anyway, or Europe. Let's call it not North America.
Not North America.
But so there's a website called Better Briefs. And so they looked at how people brief, and they did a whole bunch of surveys trying to figure out the briefing process. Because in essence, I think the brief is the strategic source, or the source for strategy in communication in a marketing sense. In theory, a brief should outline everything that you need and the reasons why we did one thing versus not another, to provide guidance on the execution side, particularly when it comes to strategy. But in general, it's also used for media planning and execution and all that. Yeah. And so there's this amazing thing where 80% of the marketers are writing these briefs, think they're amazing at it. 10% of their agencies agree. So there's this wicked gap in terms of like what we think we're doing in terms of writing clear strategy, and then the people on the other end who are receiving the strategic documents and guidance going, I don't think there's anything strategic here. So I think there's a lot of confusion around what strategy means. And we talked to Roger Martin about this, who would know. And so one thing he's talked about a lot is like a lot of people confuse strategy and tactics. They read a list of things to do and they think that's strategy.
Totally. Yeah. Well, I think you and I were talking about this as well I think it was when we were actually talking to Roger, and it was around the notion that you're sitting in these so-called strategic sessions, but the only thing you're actually outlining are tactics, not actually a strategy. It's like you're already talking about the how. Yeah. And the how is not what's needed in that moment. And I like that you brought up briefs. I agree with you that I genuinely believe that they're a marketer's Achilles heel.
Yeah.
I really do think, because a proper brief, you're right, does inform creative. Mm-hmm. It does help inform media. It does help inform execution and a go-to-market strategy. Mm-hmm. It's all of that. It is technically, if it's done right, it is the silver bullet that sets up the campaign the best possible way, or at least set it up for in terms of success, because there's research that happens in there. It's understanding, your personas, any sort of consumer research that you may be in dating. I don't know how many how many practitioners actually go back instead of just copying and pasting something in, and I'm marketing is definitely, the brief itself, if not done properly, will lead to, maybe moldy hamburgers.
Yeah. I honestly think that, because you get, without having clarity, and and I love, we talked to Jennifer Reel. Yeah, Beal is an actress. Jennifer Reel. And Roger Martin, both a lot about strategy. They're both brilliant at it, and recognized for that. And so, it really is about as much choosing what to do as it is choosing what not to do.
Yeah.
And often I think that's where briefs fails. That there's so much ambiguity because they're not defining the not to do part. They're just saying, well, let's play over here. We're going to, create this ad. We're trying to capture awareness. Well, that doesn't help. Like, for what?
Hated that. Hated that.
Yeah, we're driving an increase in awareness for our product, brand, service. To who? For what? And what do they think about when they're thinking about buying these products, which is the category entry point stuff that I know we've talked about a lot. Like, there's so much there that I think when we think about briefs in general, or when I used to think about briefs before, doing a lot of over the last couple of years, the work I've been doing here, it was like a pretty quick thing. Like, I just got to get a brief out. What a pain in the ass. I got to get a brief out because, people are asking for it. It was
the last thing you wanted to do.
Yeah. Why can't we just talk about this, figure it out? But the discipline of going through the briefing process should be a bit laborious, because you have to debate what we're trying to do, what we're trying to achieve, have really smart goals, like specific, measurable, attainable, realistic, time bound, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
And have a clear outcome that you're you're measuring it, which means you have to understand like all the inputs.
Yeah.
And so that takes time, but that's one of those things where I think it's challenging because we don't give briefs enough time to write.
No, and I'm sure as we can come up with a million reasons why it constantly gets pushed, but the reality is it does require. And usually, what will happen is like you'll pawn that task off to someone younger in on your team to kind of take it on, because they'll likely have more time to kind of articulate and think about it, because they're not inundated with a lot of the meetings, say a lot of the leaders are. But at the same time, the leader and some of those that have longer tenure in the practice will have a more spherical understanding of what exactly is being asked for, what is requested. And usually when it's just like, okay, the coordinator sends it up to you, you're reviewing it, you just do a pass through. You're not usually reading it line for line. And that again is probably a problem as well. It's like, we know it's important. We don't give it the due, I guess, the respect that it actually deserves. And we don't allocate the time to say, you know what, we need to do this brief. Let's all sit in a room and let's go through it. It's going to take a couple hours, 3 hours, and let's just hammer through it. It usually doesn't happen that way. It happens in isolation, sitting on a desk, and it's unfortunate because it is essentially it's the document that may determine the success or not the success of the campaign in its entirety. It's not down to the execution.
Yeah, and going back up one level from, say, the people that would be writing briefs to, say, the CMO, I think where, maybe that's part of where that tenure story comes from, is that, or that comment that you made about the CEOs rate the CMO as having, what was it, like a poor understanding of strategy and innovation.
Yeah.
And I think that could be it, because there's partly because the briefing process needs more work and needs more clarity, partly because, the CMO isn't going to write the brief necessarily, but they're probably involved in developing the strategy. But strategy isn't done, as your point is perfect. It's not done in isolation. It has to be in agreement with everyone. And as I was thinking about this, like there's a symptom, I think, that you could tell whether your organization has clear strategy or not, in that if every year, because we're coming into planning season, strategic planning, if your strategy is changing every year, you probably don't have a good strategy or a clear strategy, because it doesn't need to change every year. It only needs to change when the assumptions of your strategy change, which could be like 3 months from the time you did it, or it could be 3 years from the time that you did it. So if it's changing on a calendar because you have a meeting talking about strategy and that, you're changing your idea, then I think that's probably one of the symptoms of the organization not having a clear strategy.
Something just popped to mind. And I think like when you have marketers, say, assuming a new position for the first time in a new organization, we want to show impact. We want to drive results. And usually the things that we lean on quickly to kind of show that is sometimes you'll have, there's a brand refresh, or we're going to change the colors of the logo, or we're going to do some of these quick wins, to help kind of reinvigorate the brand. When I think it goes back to what you're saying, is like, if there hasn't been enough research to understand what exactly is, the core problem, or what it is that we're trying to solve, I think that would change the perception of marketing, of it not just being like the coloring department, that it is a strategic arm in the business that helps us drive, at the end of the day, the common goal could be revenue. Right? Yeah. But we love the shiny things. Yeah. We love them.
Yeah. The coloring department comment is great too, because it's a thing, but it's also one of those things that I think if you can't defend your creative, then that's also probably an indicator that you don't have a clear strategy. Because the creative, often I used to think of it as just being like, I don't know, creative people, or you work with an agency and they come up with this idea and you're like, oh wow, I love it, or I hate it, I don't like it at all, or whatever the in between is. but I had no context to provide really solid evaluation about why I did or didn't like something. It was just, I don't know, I just don't like it, or I do. And so having clearly defined strategy, it should be reflected in the creative. There's a dotted line, or not even dotted. It's a direct line for the rationale of why you did this piece of creative. And so having, clear strategy helps with the creative effectiveness for sure, because then you've got a reason for that. And then when you have somebody that says, oh, I showed it to my daughter, they didn't like it. Then you go, well, that's great, but your daughter isn't the target audience. And, we did this because of, point 1 through 15, and it supports your strategy. And so then you have something solid to defend against that kind of a comment.
Totally. Yeah. Oh man, probably the worst feedback you could ever get. It's like, oh, my family member didn't like this. I'm sorry. But there's help on its way, right? I think there's a lot of work that's happening. We recently talked to Grace Kite, and we talked about, the kind of metrics and how they're helping kind of layer in a different view, if you will, of the efficacy of marketing in totality. There's some great work that's happening at the Ehrenberg and Bass Institute as well, which is applying a lot more of the sciences, really kind of understanding, they have evidence-based models for growth, how brands grow. There's a lot of work that's happening there consistently. And we talked to Nicole Hartnett from the Ehrenberg and Bass Institute, and she provided some great tidbits there as well. So not all is lost.
Yeah. Well, and another, and Kantar helped us out with providing some of this research that we were doing here as well. And so they've got a total marketing ROI metric as well that looks at long and short-term impact. You're right. I think there's I think what I get excited about, having started in my career, going way back when, I thought I was going to be a doctor. It turns out you need good marks.
What?
Whatever. Fine. But so I studied, I had science in as a background, and then started my career in pharma. And so I was just used to the idea of evidence-based decision making. And then coming into marketing, it was just in advertising in general and sales. It was really
you don't need
eye-opening. But I think it is moving that way, right? Because there is
big time
a lot of really interesting companies, people, organizations doing some amazing work, like Grace, like the Ehrenberg Bass Institute, the B2BI Institute, or the Business to Business Institute from LinkedIn. Kantar is doing some great work. And so there's all these really robust statistical models and research that's being done to show what is truly effective and sort of counterpunch those stories we tell ourselves.
Yeah.
And so, it's not necessarily those stories that are, surprisingly, a lot of the stories we tell ourselves aren't actually effective. In general, loyalty is not something that we have a tremendous amount of influence over, other than through market share. Loyalty is, from Ehrenberg Bass Institute's work, is real, but it's not something we have a tremendous amount of impact over. And yet when we read textbooks, like you and I both doing our MBA, we're reading our textbooks, and the marketing textbook talks about, it's cheaper to keep a customer than it is to acquire a customer, and loyalty is the be all end all. And it talks about the story about Harley Davidson logos being tattooed on people. And that's the goal that we should all be working towards. And turns out that's not really that true. There's lots of evidence that would suggest otherwise. Not to say that loyalty is not real. It's just not nearly as influential as we think it is. And that one point in particular about cost, it's cheaper to keep a customer than to make a customer. It's kind of pointless. Even if that were true, which is it isn't.
It isn't. Yeah.
Even if it were true, what is that going to, who cares? You still need to get new customers. There's always going to be churn. And so even if you
Totally.
relied 100% on your customer base to be the only source of revenue,
Yeah.
I mean, callously, people die, right? So, and there's other reasons why that they would churn, like maybe they move. But the very real fact is that a customer won't be your customer forever. And so even if you only relied on customer retention, you're eventually your business will fail to be a going concern because you just don't have enough customers to keep your revenue stream up.
Let me ask you this, and this is going a little bit off script here, but why do you think it is the case that as marketers, we default to some of those, I don't know, those things that, we're always just being said in the discipline? And you're right, you brought up a good one where it's like, if you're, it costs less to, convert an existing customer versus getting someone that new. But why is it that we go back and become so myopic, if you will, in our discipline? And I think we do that maybe unconsciously, but sometimes we do it. And why do you think we do that?
I think because it's complicated. The real answer is complicated. And I think, truthfully, I think that's part of what makes the Ehrenberg Bass work so appealing, because there's a whole bunch of laws of science that Nicole talked to us about, or laws of marketing, and they're scientific based, tons of evidence, proven again and again in different markets. And so you can go through, I don't even know how to say this properly, the Dietrich, the MBD.
I think it's
the MBD law. Like you can go through all these, like the law of duplication of purchase, the double jeopardy law. You can go through all these things, but they're not like, they're challenging to think about, but they're also not like as memorable as you would hope. So when you hear like things like, it's cheaper to keep than to make a customer, that kind of sticks because it's simple.
It's simple. And a lot of people have heard it. Right. So there's familiarity in that phrase.
And then because a lot of people have heard it, you go, oh, it must be true.
Must be true.
Right. And so that's why I think something like, How Brilliant Grow you brought up before is 10 years old, and why it's now gaining momentum, I think, is because the simple story is mental and physical availability will drive market penetration, which drives loyalty. And so, like, even if all you remember is mental and physical availability, it's a simple way to access a whole bunch of information there and do more research. And so that's why I think some of those things are important, is how you package the information. Like, you
think we'd be doing this? Sorry, go ahead.
Go for it.
I was just going to say, you think we'd be doing this purposely, but it actually dovetails perfectly into our third point, which was like the limited or misguided perspectives, right? Around the discipline. Things like, equating marketing to just being, advertising instead of everything that helps an exchange, between a consumer and a producer, if you will. Or the hammer and nail analogy, you're so quick to reach for discounts to solve a revenue profit problem. So it's like we're already predetermining what the role of marketing is, without actually genuinely taking the time of how it actually can help. And I think you're right that it also comes back down. And we talked about, us being in our MBA right now, but that textbook that we were going through, it's still training executives today. It's an EMBA program, and it's training executives today in a way to do marketing that I would argue is probably archaic. Yeah, there's some stuff in there that, it's good for people to know, but there's people still coming out of schools today that are getting the wrong information of what marketing's role is in an organization. And it's 2022.
Yeah. The part I love about the more scientific approach to things is that in general, science is self-correcting, because really everything's a hypothesis. And so the heart of science is that, like the scientific method, is you have a hypothesis, then you develop a plan to test it, and then you test it, you get the results back, and then in the purest form of scientific method, you can never actually prove whether you were right or not. You can disprove, and you can improve your confidence in your hypothesis by repeating the study over and over again. And if you can repeat it again over and over, then your confidence goes up even more and even more and even more. And so, but to actually 100% prove or disprove something, or it's easier to disprove something is to prove something absolute. So I love that because it's self-correcting. And I think that's what's exciting for me about marketing is that as it becomes more scientific, it becomes more self-correcting. Yeah.
You know, you brought up another great point. We just finished reading a book by Sandeep Dayal that talks about branding between the ears. It's like how to apply cognitive science essentially to your branding efforts. So the idea of science is becoming more and more a part of marketing when you're looking at like the understanding the consumer behaviors a lot differently and how to make sure you're building those mind structures and what are those models. And you know, stay tuned for a great podcast that's coming up on that. But I agree with you. I love the fact that the discipline is moving more to the evidence-based models where you are bringing a lot of this information in that help inform the business decisions in a different way. It's less about Mad Men and it's more about science. And I think our discipline is science.
And like a lot of, I mean, going back to my days in pharma, like a lot of the physicians there will say it's like, you know, it's a balance of science and art. And so you have to take, just because like evidence-based doesn't mean there's proof for every single thing. It means that there's evidence for something like the situation or the problem that you have in front of you. And therefore you can extrapolate that in your own way to another scenario, and hopefully that will help you provide a better outcome, with the underlying principle being do no harm. So if in marketing we use evidence, you know, again, there's not going to be proof for every scenario in every business, industry and that kind of stuff, but there's a lot of evidence that's out there. So like at the very beginning, at least go look for the evidence, because there's bound to be something.
It's out there.
And then from there, then you can go, okay, well, it worked in this scenario, worked in like a category that I'm in. And so, let's look at that and see how we can apply it to ours. And so, if you have the idea of doing no harm, at least starting from a place where there's some data as opposed to no data at all. And I think that's a good way to go in general.
Yeah, I agree. And there's a couple other misguided perspectives that we were kind of working on. And one was, don't really understand what being consumer-centric actually means. That the department or marketing as a discipline is really only leaning into, the brand love, the language, but without really understanding, again, the purpose. It's focused more on purpose instead of like the profitability side of things. And again, marketing can play such an active role in your organization, but it's being marginalized because of these misguided perspectives. And then naturally people will just fall into place, unfortunately, just because it's become what the organization feels it is. And so that must be true. Yeah.
The consumer-centric one is a really good point, because there's a lot of like, name a company that doesn't say we're consumer-centric or doesn't want to be more consumer-centric. Then and you think about that and you go, okay, cool, that totally makes sense, right? And then but then you have people inserting their own bias, talking about behavior, like science, behavioral biases into like things such as, well, I want my consumers should love me, and we have this sort of like, from a brand point of view, we have this perception that we're really important. And the reality is, like, if we were really truly consumer centric, and Mark Ritzen's got a great piece about this. The Amber Bass has got a great piece. The B2B Institute's got a great piece about this. Kantar's got a great piece about this. Like, the truth is that people don't think about us nearly as much, brands, nearly as much as we would like to think they do. Right. And so we're way better off starting from that position. Like, people don't think about me at all. And is that true or not? And then from there, really understand what consumer centricity is. Because probably likely that more people are like that than not.
You know, you brought up Kantar, that they did a great white paper, if you will, and I think it was like 2021, The Imperative Imagination.
Yeah.
And it really talks about, you know, making sure that it's not just about putting, you know, the consumer at the center, but it was also about capitalizing on the advantage or mastering your why, you know. And it argues that marketing may be in trouble because of disruptive thinking and strategies are not the norm. So we'll obviously link that in our show notes and whatnot. It's definitely a really strong read, but I think we've moved into this place right now where the discipline is suffering from short-termism.
Mm-hmm.
You know, the performance marketing side, while it gave us a totally different way of reaching our audiences, we've moved too much on the one side of being overly performance driven, which then is not creating that stickiness that is required for the mind structure, the mental availability that we keep talking about, that really affect the brand. Because we argue that it's all about the frequency, right? So I can give you the frequency through digital, but now you have all of the big publishers say, oh, you know, our attention spans are 6 seconds. Our attention spans are not 6 seconds.
Yeah.
We do have the capacity to stay engaged a lot longer. And we had great conversations with John Mowat around video marketing and its role and whatnot. And I think we talked about a brief being an Achilles heel. I would argue that performance marketing, and I'm guilty of this myself, being an advocate for performance marketing. I think it's led to this trying to do more with less. So 6-second videos, you can pump that out easily. What are you actually saying in 6 seconds? Not very much. You know, and again, if I relay it back to the book by Sandeep, you can storytell, and we're not storytelling as much as we used to.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting point, and like, especially on the channel point of view, like Kantar's got this great media report. And so it's interesting looking at the history, and I used to forever looked at eMarketer would always publish like the most to least platform where money was going in terms of media spend, most to least, and the change in that over time. And so you could look at the history of this media consumption or media ad spend report. I think it was what it was called. And you can see, like, from, I don't know, 2008, if you can go find something from back then, like, it's mostly offline, mostly traditional. And then it merges into, you know, digital, and more Google, more Facebook, you know, now more Amazon. But in general, like, I think it's an interesting thing too, when you look at how people respond to media, in the sense of, like, it's almost marketers become possessive of their medium.
Yeah.
Right. And they're like, oh, no, Facebook's awesome. Or search is the best, or whatever the thing is. Yeah. Because they're seeing that performance on that channel, or what they perceive to be performance. And so that's why
perceived performance. And
so you get these, like, perceptions and sort of stories because people are reporting, monthly or whatever the cadence is, about the performance of their channels. And then they assume often, and I'm guilty of this too, that the channel is the outcome.
Yeah.
When in reality, it's very little to do with the outcome. If anything, it's a small portion of an outcome, but it's not the business outcome. So going back to the strategy, you really got to look at the strategy, because you should be measuring and reporting against the business strategy, the business outcomes, not what the channel tells you. Because Google doesn't know your business. Facebook doesn't know your business. Amazon kind of maybe a little bit, because it's just an online sales place. But they're not the same thing.
No. They're definitely not. They're definitely not. I had something I wanted to add there from Kantar as well. Man, they have so much good stuff.
Yeah. Yeah, they do. One thing, just while you're thinking about that, like so there is, like, going back to the like the old textbooks that we were reading for marketing in our classes. Like, the one thing I do think is really good is the 4 Ps. I forget the guy's name who came up with it. Because if you think about the 4 Ps, and so the 4 Ps are price, promotion, place, and product.
Product.
And that's in general what people believe is the 4 components of marketing. And yet marketers often are just considered the promotional element. But if you use those 4 Ps, I found it really helpful for me to expand my point of view. And use the other 3 Ps that you don't really talk about very often to help guide some of the conversations and the questions and the thinking behind building briefs, as an example. And how does what I'm saying in my brief affect those other things?
Right.
Or, I need to learn more about pricing, or I need to learn more about place. It's not just about putting an ad in the market.
Well, we touched on this earlier, and it actually forces you to venture outside of your silo.
Yeah.
The marketing silo. So when you're talking about pricing, like, it's forcing you to go have conversations now with another department, likely, that is responsible for maybe the pricing strategies, right? So understanding those nuances and truly pushing marketers in uncomfortable areas, if you will, and at the same time forcing them to learn new language. And I'm not talking literal language, but business language, which a lot of us will naturally shy away from, because we just lean on what we know.
Yeah. We started this conversation by thinking, like, is marketing in trouble? And so we talked about a whole bunch of things here, the limit or misguided perceptions, decline in effectiveness, CMO tenure as sort of evidence points for that. Having gone through a bunch of the conversations, replaying some of the conversations that we had right now in my head, what we just did today plus other ones, do you think marketing is in trouble, or where do you land on that idea?
We have to be careful. I firmly believe that. I think we have to be very conscious and understanding what our role actually is. And so, in short, yes, maybe not to the way that it really kind of comes out as a clickbaity title, but I do believe we have to be very careful moving forward, because I think as a practice, there are things that we aren't leaning into more of, and it's forcing us to kind of stay somewhat disjointed from the rest of our organizations and our businesses, because we just kind of stay in our lanes. So from that perspective, I believe, like, we're right in kind of sounding the alarm. It's like, we have to be better. I really do believe that. There is help on the way. And, we talked about, the science-based studies that's coming into behavioral analysis and really understanding the nuances in the consumer. So I think it's going to get better. But if we don't recognize that we are at, maybe it's not a crossroads yet, but we're approaching a crossroads for our discipline, I think we'd be remiss not to really highlight that. What do you think?
I think it's funny. I was just thinking about something one of our former managers used to say: we go ditch to ditch. And I think in marketing, you start on, like you mentioned, Mad Men. And so, like, that's one ditch maybe where it's all about creative. And then there's this evolution towards digital, and then it's all about performance. And so that's another ditch. And I think with the evidence that's mounting and growing, and the voices that are out there, and the self-correcting nature of it, I'm really optimistic actually about marketing and where it's going in the future. And it's not about throwing out the old things. Like, it's not about the death of the 4 Ps and it's the emergence of the 28 Fs or whatever it is, right? Like, fuck. I think we do ourselves a disservice by relabeling everything, because we want to have something that's differentiated. And so, we promote these things that are really just confusing to everyone, but they're repackaging the old stuff that's good and useful. So I think we have to be careful with that. I agree with you. Like we need to be careful. We need to be better. But I think that's true for everything. Like, name an athlete that doesn't want to be better. Name a musician that doesn't want to be better. Like, we should want to be better. So I'm optimistic about that. I don't know that, like, it's true. It's a clickbaity title. Is marketing in trouble? I think it's in trouble in the sense that we're trying to find our way as a discipline, and trying to figure out what the discipline is and what the right process is. And so I think we're in trouble in that there's so many voices at the table providing a lot of confusion. Going back to Mark Ritson, he's got some great courses, and sort of providing a structure for that discipline. I found it amazing. But as we talked about, there's a lot of other great new voices that are emerging that I think are really helpful in providing structure and solid evidence to give you guidance on what to do. So I'm excited about that part.
I agree. I think there's a lot of evidence here to be excited as marketers, and I think we're part of a generation that kind of, we saw the old way of marketing, and now we're almost like at that point later in our careers where we're really seeing a new era of marketing being ushered in, what is taking thinking and kind of pushing our discipline a lot further than it's ever been. So definitely, marketers should be excited. But again, I think as we've kind of reiterated, we have to be very cautious. And another thing that I think also doesn't help our discipline sometimes is we have those so-called visionaries, right? That you talked about. We were talking about the death of how many people are constantly predicting, like, what was it? Like, I don't know why I'm blanking right now, but I remember there was one clear one. I think Tom Goodwin did a great little article on that, where he's like, he had a little video of all the different predictions by like by 2020 this would have been true, or and it's not further from the truth. Like, we've even seen today from a media perspective the big shift to digital. Now all of a sudden you're seeing a resurgence of traditional media. I thought that was supposed to be dead. No, not dead. Okay, cool.
Well, and,
so how do you start?
And even at that, like, what do you call an ad? It sounds like a joke. Do ads walk into a room?
walk into a bar.
What do you call an ad that is on TV but is coming to you through a digital pipe that I bought on my own through, let's say, Google? Google. I don't like. Who cares? Like, I think we just get caught up in a lot of the channel things. But it's a great point. Like, there's so many predictions of the death of this, or like AI and machine learning going to take over the world. Skynet's going to run the world. Like,
exactly.
AR, VR, and the whole meta thing is going to take over the world.
That
like,
topic.
Yeah.
That's a crazy one. Like the VR, like the idea of VR will take over, but we haven't even. I don't think we haven't even seen a mature AR program yet, where you're kind of like bridging the physical and the meta in one.
I know one guy that has a headset. Personally, I only know one person. I used
to know. No, actually, me too. And he uses it for gaming.
Yeah, like if you're talking about reach, like I'm not putting a lot of confidence in that right now.
No. But again, it's one of those futurists saying, like, you need. I remember when we were working together, it was being talked about then, especially around this is the next frontier.
Yeah.
Well, fast forward, what is it? Is it 10 years ago almost now? It's still not there.
Yeah.
Not even close.
Yeah. Well, and just going back to something good stuff, I think, is B2B Institute has that 2030 trends that they published. We talked about this with Ty a long time ago, but like, I like that approach. Like, they have I think they came out with it in 2020. Yeah. They're kind of the anti-trend thing. They're like, here's what we think is going to be relevant for the next 10 years. And we're going to focus on that. because there's a lot of stuff that's just noise that just is distracting. And so we think these are the big things that are going to make a difference. And so I like that because,
Agreed.
there's lots of things that it really is just distracting. It really is just noise. And so, all those examples about AR, VR, the death of everything, it ends up becoming problematic when you just bounce from one idea to the next. And, it doesn't help marketers.
It doesn't. No, I agree.
Anyway, V, this has been a great chat. Thanks.
It's been good.
It's helped me, I feel cleansed.
We got it all out there. We got our dirty laundry out there. No, it's good. Marketers, be excited. There's a reason to be excited. Started leaning into more evidence-based marketing tactics. I think for my big takeaway here is, but also start feeling more comfortable outside of what you already know.
Yeah.
And challenging yourself, your thought processes, your role in the organization. And I think there's a lot of reasons to be excited.
Yeah, I'm with you. Yeah, and just to echo that, if anyone says start with why, I would say why.
I would say why. Please don't start with why.
Where does that come from? There is evidence, and I think it's good just to be curious. Why? Yeah. Why do people say the things they do? And really, we should all be doing that anyway. Just to question things that people think are so obvious, because often they're not. There's not a lot of really good reasons for people doing certain things. No. It's just what everyone does.
This is what we do, or what we've done.
Yeah. So there's lots of innovation there too. Okay, awesome. V. Thanks, man.
Awesome, man. Thanks. Yeah, buddy. Have a good one.
You too. Ciao.